All right, we are going to talk about big idea questions relating to Islam. Islam was not only a religion, but it was also a political and social factor in the classical and post-classical eras and well into today. So let's get started with question number one. How might you account for the immense religious and political or military success of Islam in its early centuries? So looking at this map, how did Islam go from starting, where are we, over in this area, to spreading all throughout the Middle East, all throughout Northern Africa, and then up into Spain? Why were they so successful? So we have a couple different reasons. There's a shared faith of their entire Arab population. So you have a whole bunch of different types of people that are sharing this faith. The Arabs, there were Bedouins, there were settled Arabs, but they're all part of a shared faith. So there were a lot of commonalities between people, even though they did oftentimes fight and have different ideas about what Islam was and things like who should be leaders, which you should have read about. Merchant leaders desired profitable trade routes and wealthy agricultural regions. One of the biggest things to understand about the spread of Islam in the beginning versus later on is that in the beginning it was not spreading because they wanted people to convert to Islam. Yes, that was a great outcome if it happened, but really in the beginning, Islamic leaders and especially merchants and the military were going out trying to find new places to trade with, trying to find new resources, and really just to get wealthy. So the religious message of Islam was kind of taking a back seat. Another reason that Islam was so successful was that it did have an attractive religious message. It said that all people were basically equal under the eyes of Allah. Now, this is a little bit misleading, but essentially it said that everybody was equal. So if you have somebody who's been living at the bottom of the social hierarchy, all of a sudden they're being told and preached to that they are going to be equal to somebody who's at the top of the social hierarchy, they're more inclined to accept the message. Also, Jews and Christians and Zoroastrianisms found many similar elements to their own religions. So it was monotheistic. They were praying to one God, Allah. It was patriarchal. So a lot of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians were comfortable with the influence of Islam in places that they lived. They were also accepted as people of the book. So there was competition when it came to merchants and economic aspects, but there wasn't so much competition between religions. And once Islam really was established as being the government and political system where Jews and Christians lived, they weren't persecuted. They were accepted as being people who believed in this one God idea. So you didn't have a lot of issues between the religions. And then lastly, there were incentives for Muslims and Muslim converts. So again, you have the idea of equality. Once an Islamic government was established, they really promoted merchants and trade, and so that was very attractive to a lot of people, and it opened up a lot of opportunities.
All right, question number 2. In what ways might Islamic civilization be described as cosmopolitan, international, or global? So here we've got an image of a mosque in Cordoba, Spain on the left, and on the right we have an image of Timbuktu, and this is actually one of the very first universities ever created in Africa and actually ever created in the world. So as far as the Islamic civilization being cosmopolitan, I think it's pretty common for most people to view anything outside of the West, which would be Europe or the United States once it's formed, to not necessarily be considered civilized. It's easy for historians to look at the Middle East and Africa and even East Asia and kind of consider their history as less important, or the learning or technologies created there as less influential than the ones that came out of Europe. And that's because most history books are written by white people coming from either Europe or the United States. But it's important to remember that the Islamic civilizations during the post-classical era were actually quite advanced. So just like on the last slide I showed you, we have universities being founded in West Africa by Islamic people. So they are centers of learning promoted by Muslims, and they're not just going to be studying Muslim culture, they'll be studying things like Greek philosophy. But it's important to note that even though Muslim people predominantly were coming out of the Middle East and then kind of converting people across places like Africa and into Asia, that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't cosmopolitan. They did build large structures like mosques. They did have organized cities. They did have technology. So they are interacting with the world in a civilized fashion. It's not a fair assumption to assume that they're behind the rest of the world. As far as them being international, you see other civilizations outside of the Islamic Caliphates. A good example is the Malian Empire in West Africa. They are going to adopt Islam. So it's not necessarily that the only people who are Muslim in the world are the ones who are part of the Islamic empires. There are going to be other government systems that promote Islam as a religion. And then as far as global goes, you saw on that very first map that Islam at this point is spreading well throughout the Mediterranean region. So you have most of North Africa, West Africa, Spain, the Middle East, Persia, parts of India, and then into Central Asia. So you do see Islam starting to spread pretty much everywhere throughout the known world at this point. So remember, the Americas are kind of out of the picture up until about the mid-1400s because nobody knows that they exist yet. So as far as the world as the Muslim people knew it, Islam had a very dominant presence throughout most of the major trading centers in the world at that time.
Question 3, what changes did Islamic expansion generate in those societies that encountered it, and how was Islam itself transformed by those encounters? So, as you saw on the last slide and on the map from the first slide, again, going back to the idea that Islam had spread so far and became ingrained in so many different cultures that it was going to be transformed by those new cultures as well as transform them. You can see here, these are some of the things that Islam got from other places: rice from India, sorghum from Africa, mangoes from India. So one of the ways that Islam was transformed was agriculturally. All right, so populations of many conquered regions converted wholly or partly to Islam. A lot of times when Islam came in, or when the Muslims brought Islam to a new place, the old religion, especially if it was a polytheistic or animistic religion, was kind of swept away, and most of the population is going to convert wholly. When we talk about partly to Islam, that is because they're going to blend their previous religion or their known religion with Islam, which we'll talk about in just a second. Also, the introductions of new technologies, crops, and ideas. This actually goes both ways. So Muslims are going to introduce Asian and South Asian and Southeast Asian technologies or crops to places in Africa and in Europe, and also bring in new ideas, definitely. But at the same time, they're going to encounter people and different crops that they had never seen before. So they're going to be transformed as well. And so now you'll see suddenly in the Arab part of the world crops that were previously only in Africa or in Western Europe. So definitely technology is more moving west, crops are more moving east, and then ideas are kind of moving all over the board there. And then Islam was transformed by the norms and culture of the conquered societies. So Islam takes on a lot of Greek philosophy and studies Greek philosophy, also Persian philosophy and things that the Persians had left behind. Syncretism, hard for me to say that word today, means that is a blending of religions, essentially. So going up to that first point where I said that people converted partly to Islam, you see this a lot in Africa, where they have animistic and polytheistic religions. They incorporated a lot of those aspects into what becomes their version of Islam. So another way that Islam is transformed is that in each of these different regions, Islam is going to look somewhat different. So in Africa, it's not going to be as patriarchal or strict on women as it is going to be in Baghdad, where it was established, or in India, where it's going to be accepted. It's also going to look very different in Morocco. It's a much more, not violent, but militaristic version of Islam in Europe than you see in Africa. So you see this blending of culture and religion with Islam when it is introduced. So that's our discussion on Islam. If you have any questions or comments, bring them to class and we will discuss.